shifting gears to antibody titers. Back in the day that we only had whole blood. So they drew a unit of whole blood, and that was all we had to transfuse. So back in the days before we had component therapy. We would do titers, and I say we very lightly because I was not involved in this. This was way before my time. We would do titers on the units, on the O-negative units. We would titer the isohemagglutins. We titer the anti-A and the anti-B, the anti-A combo B. And the ones that had the lowest titers were the ones that we set aside to give out as uncross-matched blood, because that way, if the patient was not an O, then you would cause as little hemolysis as possible, having the donor anti-A and anti-B lysing the recipient's blood. So that was how titers in the blood bank, I guess, initially were implemented. So now after they started doing component therapy, we didn't really do the titers so much anymore. I do remember days when we did have units of whole blood on our shelf, and we had units of packed cells, and occasionally you would have to order for whole blood, and you would give the unit of whole blood out. And if you needed that red cell, but you didn't need it to be a whole blood, you needed a packed cell, you could pack it. So you could just take the plasma off and take that 80% hematocrit, and you could just dispense it and use the plasma for garbage, basically, or reagents, or show the students how what a plasma unit looks like, or whatever you want to do for it, but not really much of anything for a patient. We still do isohemagglutinin titers to some degree at Shands. If, for instance, we have a pediatric patient, and when I say pediatric, I say that is a 4 month of age or less, because that's what pediatric is in the blood bank. 4 months of age or less is pediatric. Anything 4 months and 1 day above is considered adult for the most part. So if we have a pediatric patient who has to get ABO incompatible platelets, what we try to do is make sure that they're plasma compatible, so we cause as little hemolysis as possible. There is some rudimentary ABO expression on the platelets themselves, but it doesn't really affect the life expectancy of the function of the platelets to any great degree. So you can give mismatched ABO platelets, but the plasma is what's going to cause the problems with children who are a very small volume of blood anyway. So you want to make sure that it's plasma compatible. So if we had a situation where we had a child that we needed to give platelets to, and we were limited in our capability of being able to give something that was plasma compatible, we might titer the isohemagglutins to give them the lowest titer of anti-A or anti-B, whatever was going to affect them, that we could. Another thing that we could do is you could pack it, which would be spinning it down and taking more of the plasma off of them, or you could even wash it, which would be to resuspend them back in saline. But knowing the titer is going to be able to tell you what your step is going to be. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so historically ABO. Now we use titers for the most part in prenatals. If you have a woman who is pregnant and she comes in to determine that she's pregnant, they'll do a type and screen. Then if we identify that she has a significant antibody, the best way to monitor the potential of hemolytic disease in the newborn is to check that titer of that antibody. If she's being stimulated by that antigen, then the titer is going to go up. If she's not being stimulated, then the titer is either going to stay the same or go down. It's non-invasive. It's a win-win situation. You just draw the mother and you do the titers. And you worry about the titers are going up, then you worry about doing more invasive things, doing amniocentesis and other things that you could actually test the baby to determine whether or not there's more distress there than there needs to be. So for the most part, woman comes in 6 to 8 weeks pregnant, we'll identify the antibody, we'll do a titer, we'll freeze the blood. Then, somewhere, now I've read different I guess, recommendations, but somewhere around 18 to 25 weeks, they'll go back in and they'll draw a specimen again. Now, 25 weeks to me is the better time frame, because the baby fetus doesn't really have enough blood to really be able to affect the mother very much until they're about 25 weeks gestation. Of course, sometimes they miscalculate, so we go for 18. If you think you have anti-D, you have immune anti-D that could be affecting the baby, you may want to go 18, because you might need to intervene a little bit sooner than you would if you had an anti-Kel or something. So there may be some wiggle room there, but somewhere around that mark, woman will come back in, we'll take out our frozen sample, we'll have our current sample, we'll do our type in our screen, and if it's positive, we'll do our antibody identification, make sure there's just that one antibody still there, and then we'll do the titers. Okay? And we'll do them in parallel, and we'll compare. And the reason we do that is because I may be a whole lot sloppier than you. I might incubate, because you incubate for 30 minutes. I might incubate for 32 minutes. You might incubate for 28 minutes. So there's variables involved. The cells I pick might be a little bit stronger expression than the cells that you pick. There's all kinds of variables involved. So you want to be able to compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So by virtue of taking the one that's frozen out and the one you have now, you run them in parallel. If it's more than a 2-2 difference, increasing, decreasing, okay, then there is some stimulation going on, and they need to think about a little bit more aggressive therapy for the baby. If there's no more than 2-2 difference, then it's pretty much status. If there's status quo, everything seems to be fine. Now they can do them more frequently. You can do the titers more frequently if it looks like the titer's going up. You can do them less frequently if it looks like the titer's going down. So usually after they start the titers, around the 25-week mark, they'll do them about every week or 10 days if they look like they're going up. They might do them every another 14 days, and if they're still going down, they may not do another one until the baby's born. So there's a little bit of, I guess, science involved in the whole process. Even though it's very simple test, it's very, I guess, basic to science in general, not anything special for the blood bank, and you guys are not used to anything that's, not ultra special for the blood bank. This is just standard serial dilutions. Okay, the things that you need to remember if you're doing them for prenatals: you're going to freeze, you're going to compare. After you compare, you're going to take the current one, you're going to freeze that one, throw the other one away. So when they come in another one, the next time you're going to take that sample and compare it to the sample that was the most recent, and see if there's more than 2-2 difference. If I do a titer today on the baseline and I get a 1 to 4, and you come in behind me and you get a 1 to 16 on the same specimen, we might have a little bit of a problem. There's 2 2s. That seems to be a bit much. So we might have a third person go back and say, okay, well, let's try it again and see, do you agree with there, or do you agree with Myra's results, before we start worrying about whether the 2-2 difference is much of a significant change. So that's always something you have to worry about. The other thing that you use titers for, we have things called high titer, low avidity antibodies. These are like Chitos and Rogers and Knox and SIDS, and pretty high frequency usually. The thing that sets them apart is that they're usually reactive with pretty much every cell that you test them with, and they're plus minus 1+. They're not very strong. And so if you think that you've got a Chito or a Rogers, you can do a couple of things. One thing is Chito and Rogers can be neutralized, so you can try to neutralize them with plasma. or you could dilute them out, because if it's truly a high titer low avidity antibody, they might be a 1+ undiluted, and you get out to a serial dilution of 1 to 2058, and they're the same strength. A normal antibody, say normal very likely, but a standard antibody would gradually get weaker and weaker and weaker until it's not detectable. Whereas these high titers go on to almost forever, and they never seem to weaken. They're forever reacting. Most of the time, they're insignificant. They're a hindrance. We don't care. So here again, if you can prove that they're there, then you can neutralize them and deneutralize them and just make sure that there's nothing else underneath. You can either give mixed incompatible, or you might actually find a couple compatible units that are out there. Separate multiple antibodies. I've never actually used this to separate multiple antibodies, but theoretically, if you had multiple antibodies and you had one, let's say it was like the high titer low avidities, and you wanted to dilute it out to the point that, no, high titer low avidity wouldn't be a good example, but if you had something that was kind of pesky, we'll say an anti-Lil-C, which is pretty high frequency, but it was only maybe a plus minus or 1+ reaction. You could dilute it out to the point that it doesn't react to find out if there's anything else underneath it. But the other thing would have to have a higher titer than the Lil-C in order for that to work. And theoretically, you're supposed to be able to do that. Like I said, I've never really ever used it. I guess there's certain things that you tend to have more success with, and if you have success, you don't really try to find some of those other things. All right, so in order to do a titer, you do serial dilutions. The important thing is to be consistent. Change your tips. Everybody's got 100 microliter pipette and some tips. You get the bonus sheet. You get the partial container, so you get the extra box. Change your tips in between. Use fresh cells for testing. Use the same cells for testing. That's important because if you're doing parallel titers, you don't want to use, this R1 cell for this titer and this R1 cell for this other titer, because really and truly you're adding another variable in there. So you want to make sure you have enough cells to be able to do that. And the other part of the cell dilemma is there are two different schools of thought. The one school of thought is you want to use a homozygous cell for the antibody that you've identified, because you're going to get cleaner reactions. The other school of thought is if you're doing this for a prenatal, which is what we're doing the titers for most of the time, the most your baby is going to have is heterozygous expression of your antigen. So if you want to get a clearer picture of how much antibody is reacting that could affect the baby, then using heterozygous cells would be the better approach. It really doesn't matter which one you do, as long as you're consistent. And so wherever you work, in their SOP, they will say you will use a homozygous expression if possible, or you will use a heterozygous expression. And whichever one they dictate that you use is what you should really use. My personal philosophy is the baby's only going to be affected for a heterozygous cell, and that's what you really need to do your titer. However, I thoroughly understand why you might want to use a homozygous cell and get stronger, cleaner reactions. As long as you always use a homozygous cell, there's no problem. You can do titers in gel. Here again, if you do the first one in the gel, you need to do the second one in the gel. If your protocol says do not do titers in the gel, don't do titers in the gel, do them in the tube. So just be consistent. That goes back to the second one up there. The titer result is actually the reciprocal of the most dilute specimen that shows distinct reactivity. So if you've got one that you're thinking, this looks a little scratchy, I don't know if this is positive or not, call it negative, go to the next one. So that is what you would call your result for your titer. You can also do a score, which indicates the avidity a little bit more. So you can have a really, really low titer but your reactions can be pretty strong, in which case the score is going to give you a better indication of that, of the avidity. So for the score, what you do is you add up points for the reactions, and those two can be arbitrary because you can assign different strengths or different points to different strengths as you want to for the facility, as long as you were consistent, it wouldn't matter. Most places for prenatals are going to report out a titer and a score, although I don't know how much the physicians actually pay attention to the score. They usually just go with the titer. So you may theoretically work some places that they don't even bother reporting out a score, they just give a titer. But it is kind of a better indication for avidity. So then you're going to freeze the sample that you have from today, and if it's more than a 2-2 increase, it's going to be significant. There's my little cat counting the titer. So, is there anything else I want to tell you? Oh, I guess with the score, if it has to be, it's greater than a 10-point increase, that means it's a significant increase. So 10 points are 2 2s in the titer.
So the score is just on the left.
Hmm?
The score is on the highest division.
The score, if you had something where let's say 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 4, 1 to 8, 1 to 16. So if it was 2 plus, 2 plus, 2 plus, 1 plus, negative. Okay, so in this case, your titer would be 8. Okay. If you're going to give a score, 2 is 8, so it's 8, 16, 24, plus 5 is 23. So your score would be 23. So you add them all up. Now, usually if you're dealing with a significant antibody, you're going to read them at 37, and you're going to read them at Coombs. And usually Coombs phase is the stronger phase, and your titer is going to be a lower number, higher number, if you're reciprocal. That's why I would say most complete sample, because I don't want to confuse anybody anymore. But if you had a score, you would probably have two numbers, because you have your 37-degree score and your anti-hemoglobin score.
And it indicates that concentration would also.
Right. So, like I said, you may actually theoretically work someplace that doesn't even worry with the score. They just tell you what the titer is. All right, so what we're going to do today is everybody has a mommy here. You also have some 6% albumin I made for you. The antibody has already been identified, so all we're doing is the titer. Okay. We're going to use homozygous, we're going to use heterozygous cells, unless for some reason you can't find one. I've got some more out here. The screen cells you have in your rack could be used as well. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make serial dilutions and take our cells. We're going to use the 6% albumin as our negative control. So you're going to have a negative control that should be totally negative. And you're going to have that as your diluent to do your serial dilutions as well. Then you're going to mix it with your cells. You're going to incubate it. After you incubate it, you're going to take it out and you're going to read it. After you read it, you're going to wash them. And then you're going to add antihemoglobulin. Since this is a baby, we're going to worry about IgG only. Okay. And anything that's negative, you're going to add check cells. So you have a positive control, which is your undiluted plasma. negative control, which is just your 6% albumin. If for some reason, now this wouldn't be the case for a prenatal, but let's say you wanted to titer an anti-M. Like you had an M on your antibody identification unit. You want to titer an anti-M. Well, the M is a cold reacting antibody. So if you're going to titer a cold reacting antibody for whatever reason, like when we titer the anti-A or anti-B, you might want to utilize the room temperature. You may even want to use the refrigerator to be able to titer it. But in those cases, you're not going to use the score. You're going to go strictly for the titer, because the score is pretty much universal for just the prenatal kind of a circumstance. I've never seen the score applied for any other titer application. It's only for the prenatal application. Everybody clear on that? Okay. So pretty easy lab today. Make our dilutions, add our cells, heat block, and we'll come up with a titer. I've already done your antibody identification for you. The one thing I will say that we had to implement on titers, because we were doing antibody identification in the gel and we were doing titers in the tube, a lot of times what we would have is our undiluted sample would be negative in the tube, but yet we had identified the antibody. So, you know, a lot of times your titer may be less than 1. So keep that in mind, that if the antibody was identified in the gel, that if you don't get any reactions and you're undiluted, do not be totally alarmed, because it could be a situation where it's less than 1. Less than 1 is a valid titer if that's what you get. So don't say, another thing that I guess is a recommendation most of the time is not to use enhancement when you're doing titers, to just increase your time frame. So that's why you've got a 30-minute incubation period as opposed to 15, or 10, whichever. We've been using less, so 10. So you do have a little bit longer incubation time for that, and that's because you don't have any enhancement. If you don't have enhancement, you have to give a little bit more opportunity to get in there and react if they're going to.